Welcome to episode 5 of the Byzantine Empire series. Let's continue the story. The forests where shepherds once walked now echoed with the neighing of Seljuk cavalry. Greeks and Armenians living there found new rulers and new ways of life. In Constantinople and other Greek lands, leaders grappled with this transformation. Taxes in newly Turkish lands vanished, cutting the empire's income. The need to levy mercenaries and hire Frankish knights grew. Soon, under Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, from 1081 onward, Byzantium would turn west for aid. By 1095, Alexios would ask the Pope and Western kings for military help, a plea that itself sparked the First Crusade. That crusade was as much about helping Byzantium recover Asia Minor as it was about Jerusalem. Looking back, medieval writers and later historians often call Manzikert the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire's rule in Asia. This sounds dramatic, but it reflects a deep truth. In that calm summer long ago, things changed irrevocably. A once mighty army was broken, its emperor deposed, its eastern provinces left exposed. Empires are not felled by one battle alone. Rather, the Battle of Manzikert was a great crack in the empire's foundations. Over the centuries that followed, Anatolia, the rich heartland of Byzantium, was lost piece by piece. The skyline around Cappadocia and Phrygia grew steadily Muslim and Turkish. Orthodox churches became mosques, and the Greek-speaking farmers gradually became subjects of sultans and beys. Back in the old capital, each new emperor would look nervously east at less and less land to defend. And yet, from our quiet vantage, we can think of that day in 1071 not in terms of horror, but of a slow fading. The fields around Manzikert saw the steady turn of the seasons before and after the battle. Once, the dawn chorus of birds and the hum of insects would have filled those grasslands. On the 26th August, arrows cut through a summer breeze. But by nightfall, the plains lay mostly silent again, once the soldiers fled. Over time, even the memory of the imperial armies faded from these pastures. In this gentle light of history, Manzikert stands as a turning point. The Eastern Roman Empire, for 7 centuries a bulwark of Eastern Christendom, had begun to change. Yet it survived in weakened form for centuries more. The Eastern emperors would find new vigor under the Komnenoi and later the Paleologoi. But Anatolia would remain a different world. As we reflect on these events in the calm of evening, we see the tapestry of history folded in two.
In one panel lies the old Byzantine Anatolia, with its hardy villages, towns of red tile, and silent fortress ruins. In the other panel, the future Turkey, with its new churches and scholars, grew out of that silence. The Battle of Manzikert was the seam between them. No single night could undo an empire, but under the quiet stars, Manzikert quietly ended one chapter and began another.
In the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood at its nadir. Decades of civil war and costly defeats had shrunk its borders and drained its coffers. By 1081, Anatolia had largely fallen under Turkish control, and the Normans threatened the western shores of the empire. Into this troubled moment came a general named Alexios Komnenos, who was crowned emperor of Constantinople. The Komnenian dynasty he founded then set to work on a determined restoration of the empire's fortunes. This era is often called the Komnenian Restoration. Over more than 100 years, the emperors Alexios I, John II, and Manuel I rebuilt the military forces, reformed the finances, and reclaimed lost territory bit by bit. They strove to revive trade and agriculture in the empire's heartlands, even as new crises arrived. Crusader armies passed through Byzantine lands, uneasy alliances were forged with Western powers, and restless neighbors prowled the borders. Through it all, the Komnenoi guided the empire, stitching its provinces back together and stabilizing Byzantium for a new age. When Alexios Komnenos came to power in 1081, he inherited an empire beset on all sides. The Normans, under Duke Robert Guiscard, had invaded from Italy, capturing Durazzo and marching on Thessalonica. Alexios rode out to meet them, but at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, his army was routed and the emperor himself wounded. Luck turned when Duke Robert died in 1085. The Norman advance then stalled and ultimately collapsed. However, the dangers to Byzantium were far from over. In 1090, a vast horde of Pecheneg horsemen crossed the Danube into Thrace, threatening Constantinople. With few troops at hand, Alexios made an alliance with the Cumans, another nomadic people, bribing them to join the Byzantine army. On April 29, 1091, the allied Byzantine Cuman force caught the Pechenegs by surprise at Levounion and utterly routed them. The Pecheneg menace was ended for good by that decisive victory. With its borders now more secure, Alexios turned inward to rebuild the shattered state. He tapped church treasures and heavily taxed the great landowners to refill the empty treasury. In 1092, he introduced a new gold coin, the hyperpirin, to stabilize the currency and halt inflation. He also resumed levying soldiers and began granting troops land in return for military service, recreating the old theme system in a new form. John II succeeded his father on the throne in 1118 and earned the nickname the Good. He was just and pious, and he never blinded or killed a rival during his long reign. John joined his armies in the field and proved as determined as his father had been. Facing enemies on all sides, he first fought nomadic invaders in the Balkans. In 1122, he led the imperial army to victory at Beroia, Lebyunion, where Byzantine troops and their Cuman allies crushed the last great Pecheneg horde. He also fought off Hungarian and Serbian attacks in the region, rebuilding fortresses along the Danube and driving the invaders back. These victories secured the Balkan frontier and earned John respect even from Western allies. With the Balkans secure, John turned to the east. He led repeated campaigns into Anatolia, capturing fortress after fortress from the Turks. Among his gains was the ancestral Komnean land around Kastamonu. Year by year, he pushed deeper into Asia Minor, taking strongholds and freeing towns. Each new frontier was then fortified. He built citadels at Lopation, Acurius, and Laodicea to guard the approaches. These efforts allowed agriculture and trade to return behind the Byzantine lines, bringing war-torn provinces back to life and reviving local prosperity. Toward the end of his reign, John made a final push into Syria. He recovered the Cilician coast and forced the Prince of Antioch to recognize Byzantine overlordship. But just as he prepared to march on Antioch itself, fate intervened. In 1143, the emperor slipped while hunting and suffered a poison wound. John II died a few days later. Though his final campaign was cut short, his steady efforts had already achieved much. He left his son Manuel a stronger empire, with large parts of Anatolia and the Balkans under firm Byzantine control. Manuel I Komnenos was still a teenager when he became emperor in 1143. He was charismatic and energetic, with a love of Western culture and courtly display. Manuel dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire's ancient glory, and he built alliances accordingly. He treated the passing armies of the Second Crusade, 1147 through 1149, as honored guests, and arranged dynastic marriages that linked Byzantium to Western kingdoms. Through diplomacy and strategic marriages, he extended Byzantine influence over Antioch and Jerusalem, reinforcing the Orthodox presence in the Holy Land and stretching his empire's reach to the corners of Christendom. On the battlefield, Manuel campaigned widely. In 1147, the Normans of Sicily attacked and seized the island of Corfu, but Manuel recruited a Venetian fleet and recovered it by 1149. Undeterred, Manuel turned north, and in 1167 won the Great Battle of Sirmium against the Hungarians, annexing Dalmatia, Croatia, and Bosnia into the empire. By the late 1160s, his influence extended from the Adriatic Sea to the Black Sea, making Byzantium the dominant power in the Balkans. In Anatolia, Manuel continued the struggle against the Seljuk Turks. His most famous clash came in 1176 at Myriokephalon, where the Byzantine army was ambushed in a mountain pass near the Seljuk capital. The defeat shattered Manuel's hope of conquering the interior of Asia Minor, though much of his army managed to escape intact. After that, Manuel fortified the rich coastal and river lands he already held, and even managed to secure occasional tribute from some Turkish rulers to keep the peace. When he died in 1180, the empire still controlled most of Asia Minor's fertile plains and much of the Western Balkans. His reign left Byzantium powerful and wealthy, even as fresh threats loomed on the horizon. Manuel's death in 1180 ushered in a turbulent new chapter. His young son, Alexios II, became emperor, but real power fell to regents. In 1183, Manuel's cousin Andronikos seized the throne by force, and 2 years later, Andronikos himself was overthrown and killed, ending the Komnenos dynasty. By that time, the results of a century of restoration were clear. Byzantium still held more lands and enjoyed more stability than it had in 1081. The professional army and functioning government built by the Komnenoi endured, helping the empire weather the next challenges. Though darker days lay ahead, the Komnenian emperors had woven a love renewal that kept the Roman world alive for generations to come. In the year 1185, the Byzantine Empire stood at a crossroads between its proud past and an uncertain future. Constantinople, the golden capital, had known decades of relative stability under the Komnenos dynasty, but now its smooth rhythm was broken by turmoil. The aging Emperor Andronikos I, Komnenos, faced rebellion within the city. Bands of disgruntled aristocrats and commoners rose up against his harsh rule. Rumors spread that he had ordered the execution of even his own kin, and had turned the capital's streets into scenes of fear. One morning in September 1185, the situation came to a head. A great crowd of citizens gathered at Hagia Sophia and declared Andronikos deposed. The gentle sunlight of early autumn fell on a city in shock. Before many eyes, the once feared emperor was dragged from his palace, beaten by the mob, and at last killed. The Komnenian era had ended in violence at the very door of the cathedral. In the sudden stillness that followed, a new leader emerged.
Isaac II Angelos, a middle-aged nobleman of the great Angelus family, was proclaimed emperor by the shouts of the populace. The name Angelos was not unfamiliar to Constantinople, but Isaac belonged to a line that traced its claim to the throne through a female branch of the imperial family.
He appeared in the great square outside the cathedral, crowned with the purple mantle of Rome, an unlikely savior in the eyes of the silent crowd. In that moment, as bells tolled softly across the city, Isaac stood at the prow of history. He was no Komnenos, but he inherited the empire's legacy all the same. Emperor Isaac II's first challenge was to ward off a dangerous enemy before it reached the walls of Constantinople. In the spring of 1185, a massive army and fleet from the Norman kingdom of Sicily had sailed east to conquer Byzantine lands. Sicily's King William II, seeing the empire weakened by internal strife, launched a bold invasion. His forces swept through the western Balkan provinces, taking one fortress after another. The city of Thessalonica, Byzantium's second city, was stormed and suffered ruin and sack. Isaiah's predecessor, Andronicus, had been paralyzed, unable to organize a proper defense, and the Normans advanced unchecked. When Isaac came to power, the Norman threat still loomed just 200 miles from the capital. But under Isaac's rule, the situation changed. He rallied the loyal soldiers of the empire, and in the summer of 1185, he sent his best general, Alexios Branas, north to confront the invaders. Branas met the Norman army near the town of Demetritzes. In a fierce battle, the Byzantine forces claimed a significant victory. The Normans, taken by surprise, lost their discipline and morale. Isaac's troops pressed the advantage and destroyed much of the invading army. The Norman survivors fled back towards the sea, and Isaac II was credited with repelling the threat that had loomed so large. For a brief time, Constantinople felt relief. Even as the Normans were beaten back, other clouds gathered on the horizon. To the north, a rebellion had broken out in the lands of the old Bulgarian Empire. The brothers Peter and Asen had proclaimed Bulgaria's independence from Byzantium in 1185, and their new kingdom began to carve out territory from the fading frontier regions. In the winter of 1186, Isaac II personally led a campaign into the Balkans to crush the revolt. But the campaign met with disappointment. In the forested passes, the Byzantine army was ambushed in a style that recalled the empire's ancient defeats. Instead of a great triumph, Isaac's army suffered a hard-fought draw and many losses. The Bulgarian rebels slipped away, and by the end of that year, the Bulgarians held much of the Balkan interior. Meanwhile, events in the east pulled attention away from Byzantium's troubles. In 1187, the Muslim forces of Saladin captured Jerusalem, shocking Europe and inspiring a new wave of crusading fervor. Pope Gregory VIII called for the Third Crusade in 1189. He appeared in the great square outside the cathedral, crowned with the purple mantle of Rome, an unlikely savior in the eyes of the silent crowd. In that moment, as bells tolled softly across the city, Isaac stood at the prow of history. He was no Komnenos, but he inherited the empire's legacy all the same. Emperor Isaac II's first challenge was to ward off a dangerous enemy before it reached the walls of Constantinople. In the spring of 1185, a massive army and fleet from the Norman kingdom of Sicily had sailed east to conquer Byzantine lands. Sicily's King William II, seeing the empire weakened by internal strife, launched a bold invasion. His forces swept through the western Balkan provinces, taking one fortress after another. The city of Thessalonica, Byzantium's second city, was stormed and suffered ruin and sack. Isaiah's predecessor, Andronicus, had been paralyzed, unable to organize a proper defense, and the Normans advanced unchecked. When Isaac came to power, the Norman threat still loomed just 200 miles from the capital. But under Isaac's rule, the situation changed. He rallied the loyal soldiers of the empire, and in the summer of 1185 he sent his best general, Alexios Branas, north to confront the invaders. Branas met the Norman army near the town of Demetritzes. In a fierce battle, the Byzantine forces claimed a significant victory. The Normans, taken by surprise, lost their discipline and morale. Isaac's troops pressed the advantage and destroyed much of the invading army. The Norman survivors fled back towards the sea, and Isaac II was credited with repelling the threat that had loomed so large. For a brief time, Constantinople felt relief. Even as the Normans were beaten back, other clouds gathered on the horizon. To the north, a rebellion had broken out in the lands of the old Bulgarian Empire. The brothers Peter and Asen had proclaimed Bulgaria's independence from Byzantium in 1185, and their new kingdom began to carve out territory from the fading frontier regions. In the winter of 1186, Isaac II personally led a campaign into the Balkans to crush the revolt, but the campaign met with disappointment. In the forested passes, the Byzantine army was ambushed, in a style that recalled the empire's ancient defeats. Instead of a great triumph, Isaac's army suffered a hard-fought draw and many losses. The Bulgarian rebels slipped away, and by the end of that year the Bulgarians held much of the Balkan interior. Meanwhile, events in the east pulled attention away from Byzantium's troubles. In 1187, the Muslim forces of Saladin captured Jerusalem, shocking Europe and inspiring a new wave of crusading fervor. He summoned treasure. The empire's holy relics were melted, precious gems were gathered, and taxes on the people rose sharply. He expected war in the west to be over with the death of Emperor Henry VI of Germany in 1197, and he paid tribute to buy peace. Back in Constantinople, however, life under Alexios III was unsettled. The palace walls were gilded, but beyond them the empire's guard was weakened. Many frontier forts lay abandoned, and the once mighty Byzantine navy had been allowed to rust in its harbor. Alexios III spent lavishly on festivals and favored courtiers, seemingly content to enjoy the summer's ease, while legends of the Turkish advance haunted the eastern provinces. In the capital, the Varangian Guard kept order for a time, but their numbers slowly dwindled as the treasuries emptied. Inevitably, unrest rippled through the land. In the eyes of many, the empire had lost its way. It was rich and citified, but weak at its core. As the 1190s turned into 1200, another storm gathered on the horizon. In Rome, Pope Innocent III prepared a new call for crusade. The aim was again Jerusalem and the Holy Land, but events would divert its course. By 1202, a large army of knights and commoners had assembled in Venice, ready to sail for the east. The Grand Crusade was ill-provisioned for the journey. The Venetians, led by the elderly Doge Enrico Dandolo, demanded an enormous sum for passage of the fleet. The Crusaders had far less money than promised. To pay their debt, the Crusaders reluctantly agreed to attack the Christian city of Zara in Dalmatia on behalf of Venice. In November 1202, this shocking siege took place, Christian against Christian, under the banner of the cross. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1203, another opportunity presented itself to the Crusaders. Word reached them of Alexios IV Angelos, son of the deposed Isaac II, living in exile in Europe. Alexios IV was still young and full of ambition. He hatched a plan with the Crusaders' leaders. If the Crusaders would help him overthrow his uncle Alexios III and restore his father on the throne, he would pay their debts in gold and provide soldiers for their campaign to Egypt. He even promised to place the Orthodox Church of Constantinople under the Pope's authority. These promises were music to the Crusaders' ears, for they urgently needed both money and reinforcement. By the summer of 1203, the great fleet of the Fourth Crusade changed course from Egypt to Constantinople. Over 600 ships and tens of thousands of Crusaders and Venetians sailed into the eastern Mediterranean. On 8 July 1203, they arrived before the Golden Horn, the harbor of Constantinople. Emperor Alexios III, caught unprepared, realized too late that his own nephew and the Crusader army had teamed up against him. He fled in secret, slipping out of the city into Thrace under cover of night. As dawn broke, the Byzantines of Constantinople awoke to the sight of foreign sails on the horizon and crowds of armed crusaders on their ramparts. In the confusion, Isaac II Angelos was brought out of the dark prison cell where he had languished since 1195. Though nearly blind, he was again proclaimed emperor by the citizens and the papal legate. But the crusaders would not accept a blind ruler. They insisted that Alexios IV share the throne with his father. On 1 August 1203, father and son were crowned together in Hagia Sophia. So ended Alexios III's rule, and began a strange co-emperorship under Isaac II and Alexios IV. Yet peace did not follow. The presence of tens of thousands of armed crusaders in Constantinople changed everything. Alexios IV was weak, but determined to keep his promise. He set out to raise the wealth he had offered. He looted treasures from churches, confiscated property of suspected enemies, and demanded harsh new taxes across the empire. People of Constantinople grew weary. The city's markets were filled with foreign coin, but many hated the foreigners who demanded it. By winter, resentment boiled over. In the streets of the capital, local citizens turned on Venetian merchants and Italian sailors, attacking them in mobs. In turn, the crusaders felt betrayed. They had not yet received the gold and troops they were owed. In January 1204, the tension broke. A palace coup placed Alexios Ducas Mourzouflis on the throne as Emperor Alexios V. That night, Isaac II and Alexios IV were arrested. Isaac died soon after, some say of grief or perhaps poison, and Alexios IV was strangled in prison. The throne now belonged to Alexios V Ducas. This new ruler was not bound by his cousin's promises. When the crusaders demanded payment and safe passage home, Alexios V closed the city's harbors against them. Enraged and feeling cheated, the crusaders prepared for a final showdown. In April 1204, they raised their standards and besieged Constantinople once more. The walls had been recently repaired, but the defenders were demoralized and poorly led. Byzantine troops had dwindled during all the turmoil. Some guards slipped away, unwilling to fight for a troubled regime.
On the 12th of April, 1204, the Crusaders managed to breach the walls at a broken tower. The sight of Crusader knights flooding into the city was like a grim dawn. Over the next 2 days, the rebels ransacked the glorious capital. The great libraries, churches, and palaces of Byzantium were plundered, burned, and smashed. Mosques and Christian shrines alike were violated as the armies of the West poured into the new Rome. When the dust settled, the centuries-old Byzantine Empire had been shattered. The last Angelos emperor was deposed, and in his place the Crusaders crowned their own leader, Baldwin of Flanders, as emperor of a new Latin empire.
Byzantine courtiers and nobles fled in all directions, some to the mountains of Nicaea or Epirus, determined to carry on their heritage. But the Constantinople of the Komnenoi and Angeloi was no more. The soft twilight had fallen on the empire's last chapter, and a new dawn, a Latin rule, was about to begin. In those years from 1185 to 1204, one can trace the slow unraveling of an empire from within. Betrayal of brothers, tax revolts, coups in the palace, and the unwilling entanglement with crusading armies. The palace gates that once swung open to welcome princes now slammed shut against a generation of emperors. Walls that guarded the city were undermanned. When foreign shields menacingly loomed, Byzantium's own struggles allowed them entry. As the nights fell silent over the wreck of Constantinople, its quiet streets remembered the speeches, parades, and hopes of an empire that lasted for centuries. The grand city lay empty of its last proud banners, but the lessons of those troubled decades lived on in the lands beyond. And so the story of Byzantium's twilight came to rest, like a gentle final note in a long, venerable symphony of history. The year was 1204. Constantinople, the ancient heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, had already endured centuries of war, siege, and betrayal. Yet nothing had prepared its people for the calamity that would come, not from Muslims, nor Persians, nor Slavs, but from fellow Christians. The events that led to the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade were not born of ideology alone, but of ambition, intrigue, and desperation. To understand the tragedy, one must return to the late 12th century, when the call for a new crusade echoed through the Latin West. Pope Innocent III, ascending to the papacy in 1198, sought to renew Christian zeal after the failures and disappointments of the previous crusades. His goal was to recover Jerusalem, which had fallen to Saladin in 1187, and to reassert papal leadership over Christendom. He preached a new expedition, what would become known as the Fourth Crusade. Yet this crusade would not unfold as intended. From the beginning, its logistics were flawed. The Crusaders needed ships to carry their armies across the Mediterranean. For this, they turned to the Republic of Venice, a maritime power with vast experience in trade and transport. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, an elderly and blind but shrewd leader, offered to provide ships for a fee that far exceeded what the Crusaders could ultimately pay. By 1202, the Crusader host had assembled in Venice, but they were short on funds. Facing financial ruin, the Venetians proposed an alternative. In exchange for delayed payment, the Crusaders would help them capture the city of Zara, modern-day Zadar, a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary. The siege of Zara shocked Christendom. Crusaders, attacking fellow Christians, violated the very premise of their holy mission. The Pope excommunicated the entire force, though this was later rescinded. Meanwhile, events in the Byzantine world would steer the crusade further off course. In Constantinople, dynastic instability had once again left the empire vulnerable. The legitimate emperor Isaac II Angelos had been deposed and blinded by his brother, who now ruled as Alexios III. Isaac's son, Alexios IV, fled to the west and arrived in the Crusader camp with a bold offer. If the Crusaders would help him reclaim his father's throne, he would provide them with immense financial rewards, military support, and the submission of the Eastern Church to Rome. To many, it was an irresistible bargain. In 1203, the Crusader fleet set sail, not for Egypt, not for the Levant, but for Constantinople itself. They arrived before the massive walls of the city, a symbol of endurance and resistance for nearly a millennium. The citizens of Constantinople were stunned. These were Christian warriors under the banner of the cross, yet they demanded the deposition of their emperor. After a brief siege and naval assault, the Crusaders managed to force Alexios III to flee. Isaac II was restored, and Alexios IV crowned co-emperor. But the alliance quickly soured. The promised rewards were slow in coming. The Byzantine treasury was not bottomless, and resentment brewed among the populace, who saw the Crusaders as foreign occupiers. Tensions escalated, riots erupted, mistrust deepened, the fragile arrangement crumbled. In early 1204, Alexios IV was overthrown and killed by a court official named Alexios Ducas, who declared himself emperor as Alexios V. He rejected all Crusader demands. The Latins, already encamped outside the city and desperate for compensation, saw no option but conquest. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in medieval history. In April 1204, the Crusaders launched a full assault on Constantinople. The city's defenders were overwhelmed. The mighty walls, long considered impenetrable, were breached. The sack of Constantinople lasted 3 days. Churches, monasteries, and homes were looted. The Hagia Sophia, the crown jewel of Christendom, was desecrated. Soldiers drank from sacred chalices, shattered icons, and tore silken veils from altars. Gold, silver, and relics of saints were carted away. Fires consumed entire districts. The violence spared few. Nobles, monks, and commoners alike were killed or violated. Nuns were raped. Treasures amassed over centuries vanished into the hands of the West. Venetians, unlike the Frankish Crusaders, targeted specific relics and artworks, transporting them back to Venice. Ancient manuscripts, icons, mosaics, the very soul of Byzantine heritage, were scattered, sold, or destroyed. After the conquest, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was established, with Baldwin of Flanders crowned emperor. But this new state was weak, resented by the local population, and surrounded by hostile successor states formed by fleeing Byzantine nobles, Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. These enclaves would carry the Byzantine legacy forward. The events of 1204 did not just mark the fall of a city, they marked a shattering of a civilization. The schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, already strained by theological and political disputes, now became irreparable. The betrayal of Constantinople by fellow Christians would be remembered with bitterness for centuries. And though the Byzantines would eventually reclaim their city in 1261 under Michael VIII Palaeologus, the empire that returned was but a shadow of its former self, impoverished, depopulated, and diminished in prestige. The sack of 1204 had permanently weakened Byzantium, making its eventual conquest by the Ottomans in 1453 a question of when, not if. For those who lived through it, the fall of Constantinople in 1204 was not a single event, but a slow, unfolding disaster. It was a lesson in unintended consequences, where ambition and opportunism eclipsed piety, and where fellow Christians turned on each other in pursuit of wealth and power. The dream of a united Christendom died on the shores of the Golden Horn, amid flames and ash. The empire survived in name, but its soul had been violated. The fall of Constantinople to the Crusaders in 1204 was not merely a military defeat. It was a civilizational rupture. The centuries-old heart of Eastern Christendom was carved up by foreign occupiers, and the once mighty Byzantine Empire was scattered into fragmented states. In place of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was proclaimed, an artificial creation born of conquest and compromise. Unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the realm it now claimed to rule, Baldwin of Flanders, a prominent figure of the Fourth Crusade, was crowned as the first Latin emperor in the Hagia Sophia, amid the ruins left by the sack. Though the ceremony aimed to legitimize the new regime, it was a far cry from the majesty of Byzantine coronations. The Latin Empire, centered in Constantinople, was quickly surrounded by challenges. It was under-resourced, understaffed, and resented by the local Orthodox population, who saw the Latins not as liberators, but as foreign usurpers. To consolidate their control, the Latins divided the lands of the former empire among themselves. Venice, the chief financier of the crusade, took prized possessions including key ports, islands, and commercial privileges. Other Crusader lords received fiefs carved out of Thrace, Macedonia, and Greece. Feudal customs from the west were imposed over Byzantine administrative traditions, creating discontent and confusion. The Latin Empire was structurally weak from the start. Resistance quickly formed. From the ashes of the fallen empire rose several Byzantine successor states. Chief among them were the Empire of Nicaea in western Asia Minor, the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece, and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. These were not mere regional principalities. They were heirs to the Byzantine legacy, led by members of the old aristocracy who claimed continuity with the empire that had fallen. The Empire of Nicaea, under the leadership of Theodore I Lascaris, emerged as the most formidable of these entities. Located in a defensible region with economic resources, Nicaea became the primary center of Byzantine resistance. The Lascaris dynasty organized a functioning administration, retained orthodox ecclesiastical structures, and preserved many imperial traditions. Constantinople may have been lost, but the empire lived on in exile. Meanwhile, the Latin Empire faced immediate threats. Bulgarian Tsar Kalayan, who had been rejected as an ally by the Crusaders, took the opportunity to wage war. In 1205, at the Battle of Adrianople, Baldwin I was captured and later died in Bulgarian captivity. The loss of their emperor was a severe blow to the Latins. Though his brother, Henry of Flanders, succeeded him and proved a capable ruler, the empire remained fragile. Religious tensions only worsened the situation. The imposition of Latin clergy upon an Orthodox populace deepened resentment. Attempts by the papacy to enforce union between the churches failed. The Orthodox Christians in former Byzantine lands remained loyal to their traditions and spiritual leaders, many of whom found sanctuary in Nicaea. Over the following decades, the Latin Empire was beset by instability. Its borders shrank under pressure from Epirus, Bulgaria, and Nicaea. Constantinople itself, though still a magnificent city, suffered from depopulation and economic decline. The Venetian merchants grew wealthier through their dominance of trade, but the local population struggled. The grandeur of the imperial capital had faded. Nicaea, on the other hand, thrived. Under John III Ducas Vatatzes, with 1222-1254, the empire in exile expanded its territory, improved its economy, and became a center of cultural and intellectual life. John III fostered alliances, reformed taxation, and supported agriculture and the church. He became widely respected, even by Western observers, as a wise and just ruler. After John's death, his successors continued the push toward reclaiming Constantinople. In 1259, Michael VIII Palaiologos emerged as a dominant figure. A seasoned politician and military leader, he defeated the Latin-aligned forces at the Battle of Pelagonia, weakening Latin influence in the region. He then turned his attention to Constantinople itself. By 1261, the Latin Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its territories had been reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople and a few outposts. Morale was low, and finances were depleted. That year, an unexpected opportunity arose. A small Nicaean force under the general Alexios Strategopoulos was conducting reconnaissance near the city. Learning that the Latin garrison and fleet were absent on campaign, Strategopoulos made a bold decision. In the early morning hours of July 25, 1261, the Nicaean troops entered the city through a secret passage. Meeting minimal resistance, they quickly secured key positions. The Latin Emperor Baldwin II fled, abandoning the city. Michael VIII entered Constantinople days later and was crowned in the Hagia Sophia, restoring the Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologos dynasty. The restoration was hailed as a triumph, but the Constantinople that Michael reclaimed was not the imperial jewel it had once been. The city was economically crippled, its population thinned, its infrastructure neglected. The treasury was empty, and much of its former territory remained in foreign hands. The task ahead was immense. Nevertheless, the symbolic weight of the restoration was profound. After 57 years of exile, the Byzantines had returned to their capital. The Latin Empire, created in the fires of conquest, had vanished. But the scars of 1204 would not easily heal. The unity of Eastern Christendom had been shattered, trust in the West was deeply broken, and the Byzantine Empire, though reborn, would never again reach the heights of its former glory. This period of exile and recovery revealed the resilience of Byzantine identity. Even without their capital, the Byzantines preserved their institutions, culture, and faith. In Nicaea, they sustained the idea of empire, not merely as a realm, but as a sacred mission. And when the gates of Constantinople reopened, it was not just a city that was reclaimed, but a legacy. Yet the challenges were far from over. The restored empire would face new threats, both internal and external, and the long shadow of decline would continue to loom. But for a moment, at least, the flame of Byzantium flickered back to life. The recapture of Constantinople in 1261 by Michael VIII Palaiologos marked a critical turning point in Byzantine history. After more than half a century of Latin occupation, the ancient city once again found itself under the control of a Byzantine emperor. Yet, while the symbolic act of restoration rekindled imperial pride, the reality that awaited Michael VIII was one of immense challenge. The empire had returned to its capital, but its foundations were weakened, its resources depleted, and its enemies many. Michael VIII was not born into the purple. He was a skilled general and politician from a noble family with connections to former dynasties. But he took the throne through opportunism and ambition. After securing victory at Pelagonia in 1259, he had maneuvered his way into power as co-emperor with the child John IV Lascaris. When Constantinople was retaken, Michael had himself crowned as sole emperor in the Hagia Sophia, and shortly thereafter he had John IV blinded and imprisoned. It was a ruthless act, one that cast a long shadow over his legitimacy, particularly among staunch Lascarid loyalists. Nonetheless, Michael VIII threw himself into the task of rebuilding the empire. The Constantinople he inherited was a ghost of its former glory. The population had dwindled dramatically under Latin rule, churches and palaces had been looted, and vital infrastructure lay in ruins. Michael initiated reconstruction projects, repopulated the city, and worked to reestablish the administrative apparatus. He also sought to reclaim lost territories, focusing especially on the Balkans and Western Asia Minor, though resources and manpower were limited. Diplomacy became a cornerstone of Michael's reign. He faced threats on all sides, from the Latin states in Greece, from Charles of Anjou in the west, from the Bulgarians in the north, and from the advancing Turks in Anatolia. To secure his western flank, Michael pursued ecclesiastical union with the Roman Catholic Church, hoping to stave off invasion by appealing to the Pope. This union, formally declared at the Second Council of Lyons in 1274, proved deeply unpopular at home. The Orthodox clergy and laity viewed it as a betrayal, a submission to the very powers that had sacked the city in 1204. Michael's policy of union led to widespread dissent. Monks, bishops, and even members of the imperial family opposed the union, leading to internal unrest. The emperor responded with persecution of anti-unionists, imprisoning or exiling dissenting clergy. While this policy secured temporary papal support and frustrated Charles of Anjou's plans to invade, it did lasting damage to Michael's reputation within Byzantium. Meanwhile, the situation in Asia Minor continued to deteriorate. Despite these setbacks, Michael VIII left behind an empire that, on paper at least, was larger than the one he had inherited. He had restored Constantinople, regained parts of Greece, and delayed the final collapse. But the methods he used, brutal internal suppression, unpopular religious concessions, and overextension, left a fragile state. Upon Michael's death in 1282, the throne passed to his son, Andronikos II, Palaiologos. Unlike his father, Andronikos was a deeply pious man who immediately repudiated the union with Rome. This action won him favor among the clergy but alienated the West, once again exposing the empire to Latin hostility. His reign was long, but it saw the empire's fortunes continue to decline. Andronikos II attempted reforms, especially in the fiscal and military spheres, but these often fell short. He drastically reduced the size of the professional army and navy to cut costs, relying instead on mercenaries. This proved disastrous, particularly as Turkish raids in Asia Minor grew more frequent. The empire's hold over Anatolia weakened year by year, and several key cities were lost. The emperor also faced a growing aristocracy that acted with increasing autonomy. Landed magnates in both Europe and Asia accrued wealth and power, often undermining central authority. In a bid to secure control, Andronikos elevated his son Michael IX as co-emperor, but the two frequently disagreed on policy. The final decades of the period were marred by civil war. A bitter succession dispute erupted between Andronikos II and his grandson, Andronikos III. The conflict divided the empire, devastated the countryside, and drained the treasury. After a prolonged struggle, Andronikos III emerged victorious in 1328, deposing his grandfather and taking sole control. By the end of the Palaiologos restoration period, the Byzantine Empire had once again secured its capital and maintained a semblance of imperial structure, but its power was diminished, its economy fragile, and its territories fractured. The restoration had revived the empire in name, but not in substance. The Palaiologoi had achieved what many thought impossible, the reclamation of Constantinople. Yet the effort to sustain this achievement proved beyond their reach. Byzantium, in this era, was a state defined more by survival than by strength. It held on to its past even as the future slipped away, clinging to tradition in the face of relentless change. The reign of Andronikos III, Palaiologos, began in 1328 amid the ruins of civil war. Though young and energetic, the empire he inherited was one of faltering strength and dwindling prospects. The decades ahead would see the Byzantine Empire enter. Andronikos III attempted to reverse the empire's misfortunes through military and administrative reform. He sought to re-establish imperial authority over rebellious territories and revive the economy. His close advisor and eventual successor, John Cantacuzénos, played a central role in these efforts. The military was reorganized, new officials were appointed, and attempts were made to bolster the state's finances through taxation and restructuring. Some territories in Greece were recovered, and the Aegean Islands were defended with modest success, but these were limited victories in an era of mounting crises. In Anatolia, the situation continued to worsen. The patchwork of Turkish beyliks that had emerged in the vacuum left by the Seljuks now included one particularly aggressive polity, the Ottomans, centered in Bithynia. Their leader, Orhan, succeeded his father Osman and pursued a strategy of steady, calculated expansion. In 1326, they captured Bursa, which became their capital and base for further operations into Byzantine territory. Andronikos III died in 1341, and his death triggered another disastrous civil war. The regency for his young son, John V Palaiologos, was contested by the powerful and ambitious John VI Cantacuzenos. For 6 long years the empire was torn between 2 rival courts, each aligning with external powers. Cantacuzenos sought Ottoman military support, while his enemies turned to the Serbs and Bulgarians. In 1347, Cantacuzenos entered Constantinople and assumed control, but at great cost. In exchange for Ottoman assistance, he had granted them new footholds in Europe. During this period, the Ottomans crossed the Dardanelles and established a presence in Thrace. The European mainland, which had long been a bastion of Byzantine defense, was now vulnerable. Meanwhile, the Black Death swept across the empire in the late 1340s, further weakening the population and economy. Entire towns were depopulated, trade slowed to a crawl, and food shortages grew more common. Religious and political fragmentation further eroded unity. Hesychasm, a mystical tradition within the Orthodox Church, became the focus of intense debate, symbolizing deeper divisions between different factions within Byzantine society. The empire's intellectual life continued, but it often did so in the shadow of political paralysis and theological disputes. In the Balkans, the Serbian Empire under Stefan Dušan reached its peak in the 1340s. Dušan proclaimed himself emperor of the Serbs and Greeks and invaded Byzantine territories, capturing large swaths of Macedonia and Thessaly. Constantinople remained in imperial hands, but much of the empire's former heartland was now under foreign rule. John V eventually ousted Cantacuzenos in 1354, but by then the Ottomans had already secured Gallipoli, their first major base in Europe. From this strategic point they launched further campaigns, taking towns and fortresses in Thrace and slowly surrounding Constantinople. Byzantine emperors, increasingly unable to resist militarily, turned to diplomacy and appeals for Western aid. In 1369, John V traveled to Rome and converted to Catholicism in a desperate bid to gain support. The move angered many of his subjects and produced little in the way of tangible aid. The empire became a vassal to the Ottomans at various points, paying tribute and acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty in order to preserve a modicum of autonomy. The late 14th century saw further setbacks. Thessaloniki fell to the Ottomans in 1387. Bayezid I, the Ottoman Sultan, defeated a Crusader army at Nicopolis in 1396, reinforcing the perception that the West could not be relied upon to save Byzantium. The empire's dependence on Ottoman favor deepened, and emperors now ruled little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings. A temporary respite came with the catastrophic defeat of Bayezid at the hands of Timur at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. The resulting Ottoman interregnum allowed the Byzantines to breathe. Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos used the opportunity to rebuild fortifications, negotiate with rival Ottoman princes, and embark on a diplomatic tour of Western Europe. But the recovery was short-lived. Once Mehmed I restored Ottoman unity, pressure on the Byzantines resumed. The 15th century brought a final series of desperate measures. Emperor John VIII Palaiologos again sought Western aid by attending the Council of Florence in 1439. There, another union between the Catholic and Orthodox churches was proclaimed, but like the earlier union of Lyons, it was widely rejected by the Byzantine populace. The cultural and theological gap between East and West remained vast. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were preparing for their final strike. Under Sultan Murad II, and later his son Mehmed II, they methodically surrounded Constantinople. The Byzantines, now reduced to little more than a symbolic state, made one last effort to defend the capital. In 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror laid siege to the city. Despite brave resistance and the aid of a few hundred Genoese and Venetian soldiers, the outcome was inevitable.
On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos died in battle, the last Roman emperor to rule from the city that had once stood as the heart of an empire stretching across 3 continents. The walls were breached, the Hagia Sophia converted into a mosque, and the city became the new Ottoman capital.
The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for over a millennium, came to an end. Yet its legacy persisted, in theology, in art, in architecture, and in the cultural memory of Eastern Christendom. Its collapse was slow, not sudden. It faded not with a single blow, but with a long unraveling, shaped by civil wars, external pressures, and changing worlds. What remained after 1453 was not merely the ruins of a fallen city, but the remnants of an idea, of empire as a spiritual mission, of continuity with Rome, of a civilization that had weathered the storms of history longer than any other. The twilight of Byzantium was long and mournful, but in its silence lay echoes of former grandeur, still resonating across the centuries. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire existed in name more than in power. What was once a vast realm stretching across continents had withered into little more than the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories in the Morea and the Aegean. The once mighty imperial court clung to traditions and ceremonies, even as its walls enclosed a hollowed, weary capital. Outside those ancient walls, a rising power loomed, the Ottoman Turks, led by a young and determined sultan, Mehmed II. The lead up to the final siege was shaped by decades of Ottoman expansion and Byzantine weakness. The empire had survived numerous threats over the centuries: Persians, Arabs, Crusaders. But by the 1400s, it was a relic surrounded by formidable neighbors. The Ottomans had captured Adrianople in the 1360s and steadily advanced into the Balkans and Asia Minor. Constantinople, isolated and impoverished, found itself surrounded. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, ascended the throne in 1449. He was a capable and courageous ruler, but he inherited a city in terminal decline. The population had dwindled, the treasury was empty, and the once proud Byzantine army had been reduced to a small, ill-equipped force. Constantine appealed to Western Europe for aid, renewing the plea for church union between Rome and Constantinople in hopes of military support. While the union was proclaimed in 1439, it was deeply unpopular among the Orthodox clergy and laity, and did little to bring tangible help. In the West, the Catholic kingdoms were embroiled in their own struggles, and enthusiasm for another crusade was limited. Only a few hundred volunteers arrived, the most notable being the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, who brought a small but well-trained contingent to help defend the city. Meanwhile, Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, was preparing his forces. A man of vision and ambition, he saw the conquest of Constantinople not only as a strategic goal, but as a fulfillment of destiny.
In early 1453, he amassed a vast army, estimates range from 60,000 to over 100,000 men, and brought massive cannons including the legendary Basilica, a huge bombard capable of bringing down even the strongest walls.
On April 6, 1453, the siege began. Constantinople's defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, including foreigners and civilians pressed into service. They faced overwhelming odds. The city's land walls, built by Theodosius II over 1,000 years earlier, had withstood many attacks, but they were aging. The sea walls were less fortified, and the defenders lacked sufficient men to guard every stretch. The Ottomans encamped outside the city, bombarding the walls day and night. Mehmed ordered constant attacks, testing for weaknesses. His fleet attempted to blockade the city from the sea, but the Byzantines used a massive chain stretched across the Golden Horn to prevent Ottoman ships from entering. In a bold maneuver, Mehmed had ships hauled overland on greased logs to bypass the chain, shocking the defenders. Inside the city, morale was strained. The population prayed in Hagia Sophia, joined in processions, and clung to the hope of divine intervention or Western rescue. Constantine the XI remained resolute, overseeing defenses and encouraging his troops. He refused to abandon the city, declaring that he would live and die with his people. The final assault came in the early hours of May 29th, 1453. After weeks of bombardment, the walls had been breached in places. Mehmed launched a three-phase attack. The first waves were repelled, but the defenders were exhausted. In the chaos, Giustiniani was wounded and evacuated, causing confusion. Ottoman troops exploited the opening, scaling the walls and entering the city. Constantine the XI, true to his word, fought on the front lines. Accounts differ, but he is believed to have died in battle, refusing to flee. As Ottoman forces poured into the city, looting and violence followed. Mehmed had promised his troops 3 days of plunder, and while he later intervened to restore order, the damage was done. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire. After more than 1,100 years, the Eastern Roman Empire ceased to exist. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, and Mehmed II entered the city in triumph, proclaiming it the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. For the Christian world, the loss was profound. The fall reverberated through Europe, seen as a cataclysmic event. Some hoped it would galvanize a new crusade, but such dreams faded. The Renaissance, already underway, absorbed the shock, and Greek scholars fleeing the city helped spread classical knowledge westward. For the Ottomans, the conquest confirmed their ascendancy. Mehmed II styled himself not just as a Muslim ruler, but as the heir to the Caesars, embracing the legacy of Constantinople. The city would rise again, not as Byzantium, but as Istanbul, a center of Islamic culture and imperial power. In the quiet aftermath, the great churches lay silent, their domes echoing with new prayers. The city, though scarred and transformed, remained alive. The Byzantine Empire was gone, but its memory endured, in art, in theology, in the architecture that still stood. Its final chapter had closed, but its story would continue to shape the world for centuries to come. That was the final episode of the series. Thank you for watching. That was the final episode of the series. Thank you for watching.